Well, I don't know. I don't know if it's possible. Possible that because people died that they're fearful of this. But they're, for whatever reason, we don't see joy in this at this point. We see lament. We see sorrow for some reason. And so what I want us to look at this is in two questions that were really, really asked in this text. One is this: how do we deal with God's wrath? The Philistines got that question right. How do we deal with God's wrath? Now, I don't mean necessarily that they got the right answer, but that was the question that they were asking. And it's the question that we all ask: how do we deal with God's wrath? And I believe when we said in the very beginning, what are the things that non-believers get right about religion, about God? They have this understanding: God is angry. God gets angry at the things of the world. He gets angry at injustice and sin and depravity. He's angry at those things. And so the question that they were trying to answer was, well, how do we deal with God's wrath? How do we deal with his anger? And in that same way, we have that same question. In fact, I would even say this: in some ways, oftentimes, that becomes the means by which people come to salvation. Some people come to Christ with that understanding. They know this. They understand this. My sin has God angry. God is going to pour out his wrath on my sin if I do not know how to handle it properly, if I don't deal with it in the right way. And so for the Philistines, they understood that, and so they were trying to come up with the answer, but I think it's the same thing in the world that we live today. We understand generally that God is angry at us for the messed up way that we've treated the world. And it's why we've got all these different religions, but every one of them in some way is dealing with the anger of God. They're finding some way of appeasing, some way of dealing with the anger of God that's aimed at the human race. I think one of the advantages, if there is an advantage for the Philistines, and maybe even for Israel in this story, is that their disobedience in their sin has immediate repercussions. What was the repercussions for Philistia? Tumors. In fact, it was enough that they were pretty confident that it has to do with this. It has to do with this ark of God. That's what's causing this. They came to that conclusion pretty quick. How about Israel? What was the immediate experience of disobedience for Israel? The men died. The 70 men died. So they could very clearly see that their sin is what has led to God's anger. There's a very easy connection to make in that way. Someone said this, it's anonymous: sin wouldn't be so attractive if the wages were paid immediately. Isn't that true for us? Generally speaking, we fall into sin because we think, it's down the road, or God's gracious, he'll forgive me. He'll let this go. And so if it was this, if we were experiencing the wrath of God, we were paid immediately for it, we would probably think of our sin a little differently. Now, God's grace is that which enables us to escape his wrath. And so thankfully that is the case, but we would certainly view it differently if we were experiencing it immediately. So let's look at Romans 3, 23 to 25, because I think this really kind of helps us to see what the Philistines got right. It says this: "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood to be received by faith. That was to show God's righteousness, because in his divine forbearance he had passed over former sins." God's response to sin is wrath and judgment. It's wrath and judgment. When we sin, it is what brings God's wrath. It's what brings God's judgment. Apart from sin, if we were somehow able to live without that, we would not experience God's wrath and judgment. But the Bible makes very clear, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We all sin. And since we all sin, we all are subject to God's wrath and judgment. We are all have a target on our backs as a result of that we put there ourselves. I should make sure I add to that. But God's response to sin is wrath and judgment. And so the question that the Philistines were asking was, how do we deal with God's wrath? And they needed to first understand this. It is a product of your sin. It's because of sin. And so if we look at that in our own life today, and we might think that the judgment that we're experiencing, the judgment that we may experience sometime, the consequences that we experience might seem unfair, but in truth, it's a product of our own sin. And so the question begins with that as an important background, and it is that wrath comes as a result of sin. Romans 1:18 then says this, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness." And so we could stop right there. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness. So the question Philistines are asking, wrath of God. Why? Why are we experiencing the wrath of God? How do we deal with the wrath of God? And Paul says to the Romans, it is revealed against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. By their unrighteousness suppress the truth. And so, beginning with understanding how we deal with the wrath of God, we have to come to this understanding it is a product of sin. It is there because of our sin, because of our disobedience. Same story for the Philistines. And so in their response, their offering, here's another thing that maybe they got right a little bit. So they offer to the God of Israel two things. One is the golden tumors, and the other is the golden mice. Now, why that? Why are they offering those two things as an offering to God? What are they correct in this offering that they're giving? What's that, Rob? Taking the ark. But why tumors and mice? Or images of tumors and mice? What in that offering is maybe correct?
God caused the tumors. Yeah, they have them because of God.
Because of God, right? And so the offering that they're giving is in some way related to the punishment that they've received, right? This is what they got. This is what God did to them. This is what we're offering back to them. The offering has to some way correspond with the punishment. The offering must correspond in some way to the punishment. Let's translate that into our salvation. In what way does the offering correspond to the punishment?
Well, our punishment for sin is death, so we offer our life to Christ.
Okay. What was the sacrifice that God offered though? Christ. And how was that sacrifice offered? Through his death. The death that you deserved, the death that was aimed at me because of my sin, the offering that God gave was the death of Christ. That was the offering. The offering in some way was corresponding with the punishment that was deserved. He took the punishment that I should have had. And so in some kind of weird, obscure way, the Philistines kind of got this right. Their offering corresponds in some way with the punishment that they had received. And so Isaiah chapter 53, verses 5 and 6 says this: "But he was pierced for our transgressions." Of course, I always preface this verse with this. This is one of my kind of favorite verses in Scripture, because Old Testament, and there's this Isaiah 53, the suffering servant. And we read it today, and we read it and we're like, oh my goodness, that's Jesus. It's very clearly Jesus. And yet we would look at all the Old Testament prophets, even the disciples who would have read Isaiah chapter 53 and been scratching their head like, you know, who's this? Who's this? And maybe they would even speculate who it was. But it says this: "But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." And so the punishment really deserved by me was taken by Christ. The punishment, the offering corresponded with the punishment, and making redemption for for every one of us possible. And so I always, when I read that verse, I think of the disciples sitting around, sitting around dinner one evening, sitting around the room, and this is maybe a week after Jesus has ascended. And then somebody is reading Isaiah 53 and they're like, holy cow, this is Jesus. This is Jesus that Isaiah was talking about. I don't think it's one of those things that you would have known right away. You've been reading one day and like, wow, it was Christ. But this picture of the payment that was made for us. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 18 and 19 says this: "Knowing that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot." The value of the offering always corresponds with the offering, or the value of that which is being sacrificed for. The fact that Christ is described in the precious blood of Christ, that's what was offered for your salvation, should be all you need to know about how God views human life, how God values humanity, how much God loves humanity. And so the offering offered by the Philistines corresponded with the punishment. The next thing is this: it is that the offering must be offered to God with urgency. They in this text, they speak of doing this right away. We need to take care of this. We need to do this right away. What did he say? What was the danger of waiting? What was the reason he said, don't wait? Remember, he made a comparison. He went back to Israel's history, and what did he recall? The hardened heart of Egypt. Yes. And so that's the urgency. Don't delay on this. You need to do this, because what's going to happen is your heart's going to be hardened and you're not going to be able to respond to this. Perfect description of us in relation to our salvation. If we're delaying, if we're putting it off, we're thinking, I'll do this another day, I'll take care of this later on. And of course, the preacher always says, you don't know, you might be in a car wreck on the way home. And all of that's true. But the greater threat, the greater danger, as it's described in Scripture, is always the hardened heart. The fact that you might think that you have all the time in the world, and yet, even if you live to be 100 years old, there's a greater chance that what's going to happen is your heart will become so hardened that you cannot respond to God's call in your life. And that's the warning. And that's why, just That's why the Philistines got this right. There's an urgency. You need to take care of this as quick as possible. Hebrews chapter 3, verse 13. But exhort one another every day, as long as it is called today, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. When I was preaching through Hebrews, and this would have been probably, Hebrews chapter 3 was probably 9 months ago. Maybe not quite that, 8 months ago or so. And I preached a message on this. The fact that we think we have all the time in the world. And yet, the greater danger to me dying tonight is my heart become hardened where I can't respond to the gospel. And so that's the warning that's given to us. And the Philistines in some way had that right. The Philistines also ask this question. And it's a question we all ask: who is able to stand in the presence of God? And I say the Philistines, but also the Israel themselves ask that question. Who is able to stand in the presence of God? And so we see this then with the way that the Israelites receive the Ark of the Covenant. How they respond when the Ark of the Covenant comes to them. And the first thing is this, and it is that we have to approach our holy God with joy. There should be joy in our life. That was the immediate response to the Philistine returning the Ark of the Covenant. Israel saw it coming. They were reaping the harvest, and they saw the ark, and what they do, they responded with joy. And so as we think about our response to God, our approach to God, there should be this idea of joy. Now, what is the maybe normal way that we think of approaching God? Okay, quietly, sincerely. We're going to get to that in a moment. But I think there's another word. Fear. There is certainly a fear that is respect for God, but we don't see fear here, not immediately. We see joy, experiencing joy as they come into God's presence. The second thing is that we have to approach our holy God with reverence, and this goes along there, I think, with the description Mom just gave. Reverence. The reason that 70 men died was because they were not approaching the presence of God with reverence. Reverence would have been obedience. It would have been following the commands of God, following the very strict interpretations and rules and commands that God is giving them in terms of how they handle the Ark of the Covenant. They don't do that. And God they experience that immediately as 70 of them die. And I'm sure sending a message to everybody else that if you are going to approach a holy God, there needs to be a reverence. There needs to be this sincerity, this idea that he isn't our homeboy, he's not our buddy, he's God. And so this understanding of reverence as we approach God. We approach with joy, but we approach with reverence. Now, do we sometimes kind of think that those are antithetical, that they don't go together? We would come to worship on a Sunday morning, and we would start worshiping together. Do we sometimes think that those two can't coexist? That I could be joyful, but then I wouldn't be reverent. Or I got to pick one or the other. Either I'm going to be reverent or I'm going to be joyful. Do you think that's true? Is that legitimate? Jessie's shaking her head no. So joy and reverence coexist in the worship of God. How does that happen, Jessie?
I don't know, I just started singing that song about entering his gates with thanksgiving in your heart.
Uh-huh.
And then you, when you're there in his presence, you're falling before him in praise. So that's reverence.
Yeah.
You're full of thanksgiving because you're rejoicing and he has made you glad. So, that's, I don't know.
I think that's good. Why do we think, though, tend to think that, I mean, have you ever been in a worship service where it got like so joyful, you're like, I'm not sure. There's a little too much joy here for me. Where it feels like we've stepped out of reverence into irreverence. I think we have to be careful with that. But I do believe they coexist. That we can worship God with joy and we can worship God with reverence. Now, you can be irreverent and joyful, and you can be reverent and unjoyful. But there is certainly a place for reverence and joy, and that's the example that we have here. And God shows that He takes it very serious to respond to Him with reverence and honor and respect. And that we should not be irreverent. We should not be cavalier in the way that we approach God. And the danger connected to that is displayed very quickly. Really an interesting, here at the end though, as they decide to send the Ark of the Covenant, they called the people in the northern town there and they say, come and take this off our hands. Now, do you think that the people of, I got to go back and read the name of the town, Kiriath Jearim. Do you think the people of Kiriath Jearim heard about or were aware of the 70 men that died as a result of mishandling the ark?
Sure. Yes.
Absolutely. Can't imagine that word would not have spread. In fact, even if they said, hey, we got the Ark of the Covenant, I think it would really go nice in your temple. You guys come down and get, even if they wouldn't say anything, I guarantee the word would have reached them that, hey, you better be careful. Because when that came to town here, Beth Shemesh, 70 men died when that came here. And yet they receive it. They accept it anyway. Why is that? Why would they be willing to do that? Well, I think the offering has to be received, or the approach to God here is that we approach our holy God with faith. There's faith. You know what? That's the ark of God. I might not fully understand. It might be kind of frightening, but we're going to receive that. We will take that and we will do our best to honor God and give a place for the presence of God to exist. And so there's faith. Who knows? Who knows? People might die in our town as a result of this, but we're going to receive it anyway. And so this element of faith, joy, reverence, and faith, all required in this approach to God. Now, here's kind of an interesting, were you going to say something? Did you say something? And fear. And fear? And I think that maybe goes along with reverence there. Here's an interesting thing about Kiriath Jearim. It is not, they were not natural born Israel. They were actually a group of people that were kind of grafted in. They were the people that were willing to receive it. And so to get the story behind it, we need to go to Joshua chapter 9 and beginning of verse 17. And this is when they were heading across, destroying the conquest of the Holy Land, of the Promised Land. In Joshua chapter 9, it says, and the people of Israel set out and reached their cities on the third day. Now their cities were Gibeon, Chephirah, Beeroth, and Kiriath Jearim. So there's the town, Kiriath Jearim. But the people of Israel did not attack them, because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. Then all the congregation murmured against the leaders. But all the leaders said to all the congregation, we have sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, and now we may not touch them. This we will do to them. Let them live. lest wrath be upon us because of the oath that we swore to us. And the leaders said to them, let them live. So they became cutters of wood and drawers of water for all the congregation, just as the leaders had said to them. Joshua summoned them, and he said to them, why did you deceive us, saying, we are very far from among you when you dwell among us? And so if you remember the story, when they were conquering the land, these wise people, these kind of shrewd people, went to Israel, and they wore dirty, tattered clothing, carried moldy bread, and they pretended they had traveled for miles and miles and miles, but in truth they lived there. They were locals. And they did that as this means to deceive Israel. And they successfully deceived them. And Israel made a deal with them. Okay, we won't attack you, we won't kill you. You can help us out, you can carry water and cut wood for us. And so it goes on to say this. They answered Joshua, because it was told to your servants for a certainty that the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land from before you. So we feared greatly for our lives because of you and did this thing. And now behold, we are in your hand. Whatever seems good and right in your sight to do to us, do it. So he did this to them and delivered them out of the hand of the people of Israel, and they did not kill them. But Joshua made them that day cutters of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord to this day in the place that he should choose. So these people, the Gibeonites, who weren't really Israelites in the truest ancestral sense, became those that at this point in history were going to take over the Ark of the Covenant. They were the ones showing faith. It was the people of Israel that were fearful of what God might expect. And yet here they were willing to do this, to show faith that, if we could say it, the church didn't have. And so really kind of, I think, a neat example for us, and a consistent in all of Scripture. It's the outsider. You know, it's the Samaritan. You know, it's these people that weren't really the ones that were supposed to be picked that become the people of God, the Gentiles. We today maybe in some way are the Gibeonites of the New Testament. And so the faith that was required to approach God was displayed by these people that weren't even truly natural ancestors of Israel. And so a couple of, I think, very important questions that are handled here. One is, what do we do about the wrath of God? And the other is, how do we approach a holy God? And from this story of the Old Testament, I think we get a pretty good description, a pretty good picture of that. Any thoughts, any comments or questions?
Dan, I want to go back to, like, whenever we first talked about how Phineas and Hophni carried the ark to the battlefield, it took me back to that story you told earlier about the ark, like, coming off balance,
Yeah.
and somebody reached out to touch it and they died.
Yeah.
And these like sinful men in the ministry, like, were able to carry the ark with nothing happening to them. So it was clear that God had left that place.
Yeah.
And then it did nothing for them in battle. It was clear that God had left that place. As soon as the ark had gone to the Philistines, it was like he returned and punishment was delivered. So I wonder if when it came back to Israel, they were looking in to see, has God returned?
Yeah.
Because clearly I would think they would have known that before
Yeah.
there was punishment for touching it if you weren't
Right.
holy. So maybe they were looking to see if God had returned, and then when the 70 men that saw God died, then there was like, the people were like, God has returned, so why would we not want the ark?
Yeah.
Because God is now here.
And I think, and in verse 19, and he struck some of the men of Beth Shemesh because they looked upon the ark of the Lord. So we that sounds like they just looked at it, but some of the commentaries even that that means they looked inside it. They remember there were some very specific items that God had put in the Ark of the Covenant. And it would have been very natural for them, I think, even to just, hey, let's take a peek and see if the jar of manna is still there. And maybe that's what happened, instead of just just like a sideways glance. But I think it's probably something more like that. But even like Phineas and Hophni. So they probably, because this is ministry, this is even today, they're probably following they're doing the things like they're supposed to do visibly on the outside. And so they probably are carrying the ark and whatever their role was in a way that complied with the commands of God, And so they're not being struck down because they've got it on an acacia pole or whatever it is that they were required to do. They understood that and they did that. That's what I think probably is the case. It's a picture, I think, of unholy people dealing with, carrying on holy tasks. And we can see that even today in lots of circumstances. But again, it really shows that picture of here's what God, and remember, the Old Testament always shows us the incredible expectations of God and how impossible it is for us to keep them. The fact that all of this stuff that they were required to do, they couldn't do. And so Jesus was necessary. And so all of these things that to us seem like, it just seems like a little harsh, Seems a little unfair. He was just trying to keep it from tilting over. And yet, if perfection is what God's expectation is, which it is, then that's his expectation. That's the requirement.
They want to keep that. Don't touch it. I still don't know who ended up being able to touch it.
Well, okay, so are you talking now about the later on with David? Are you talking about when
When they were receiving it, they wanted to take a peek and see.
Oh, okay. So what are you saying? I don't understand what you're saying.
Well, I'd still be afraid to touch it.
It shocks you that anyone would do something that would take, yeah. I don't know, I don't know. It's been gone for 7 months. I'll bet they stole everything from inside it, right? I could see it. I could see that. God probably wants me to look inside to make sure everything's still there.
Zap.
Huh?
Zap.
You're like, I am glad you weren't there that day. Rob?
Talk about touching it. Why did God strike the Philistines down when they grabbed the ark?
Yeah, well, that's true. Yeah, right. Maybe because God had not revealed the expectations to them. I don't know. Maybe they handled it correctly. I don't know. Well, that's true. Yeah. I don't know. Again, this is the commandments to Israel. This is what God commanded to Israel. He did not command this to, not that he didn't care. Obviously he cared, but in some way they did pay for that though. Tumors. Anything else? Good thought. Good thoughts.